So today I wanted to talk to you about GraphWeaver, and this is an open source tool that we've built, and it helps you manage GraphQL APIs and build from multiple data sources really quickly. So we're going to cover two parts today. One is a schema-first approach, which is an approach I see a lot in the industry, and then the other is a code-first approach. Spoiler alert, I do have a favorite. I'm going to tell you in the second part how we do code-first efficiently. So who am I? Why should you care? I'm Kevin Brown. I work with a company called Exogee. We're based in Sydney, Australia. And I've been building software for a very long time. I've been building with GraphQL for a very long time. And so we've hit a lot of problems and solutions with GraphQL, so I wanted to share those with you today. I'm originally from just around the corner in Oregon, hence the accent, but I'm now Australian. So that's me. So Exogee, we are mostly focused on building greenfield solutions to modernize large legacy enterprise landscapes. So what that means is we almost always have 10, 15, 20 different systems that we have to connect, and we want to build a rapid, easy-to-use API over the top of all of that and bring it together so that we can build solutions. I prefer open source wherever possible, just so we don't force our clients to get locked into something proprietary, which is why we want to give back to the community. So when we're talking about schema versus code first, what we need to know is any GraphQL server is going to be broken down into three parts. You've got a network layer, which is going to look at your HTTP requests. It's going to figure out what they actually mean. That's going to then go to a GraphQL schema and validate, is that a valid operation? Can we do this query? Can we do this mutation? And then finally, that's going to call down into your business logic. So when you start working with GraphQL, you think, hey, this schema is at the core of this server. It's always there in the middle. It's got all of my types in it. I can see that I can get droids if I do the droid operation. Wouldn't it be really cool if we could just take that schema and we could do some sort of magic on it and get a whole server out? That'd be really awesome because it actually knows about the shape of all of our data. It could even run the database for us. And in fact, there are many products that are focused on this exact workflow. Some of them are here at the conference, and I'm going to name them specifically so they can come argue with me later if they're in the room. Please come argue with me later. This would be great fun. There are a few. I think StepZen's been renamed now, but anyway, you get the idea. But this workflow of schema to magic to server was originally what I wanted to do. And what I hit with that approach was that there's always some new thing that comes along. Now, to be fair to these types of magical platforms, a lot of different APIs and ways of working are supported, but we always hit something that's not. We've got a truck scale with a serial port, or we've got some sort of SOAP API or something horrific that we just cannot integrate into this magical box. And in fact, because most platforms work like this, you end up with this approach where you've got your magic going away. If you want to integrate your truck scale that doesn't talk to the magic black box, you end up having to build a whole GraphQL server from scratch, handle all the auth yourself, handle all of the resolvers yourself, and basically build everything from scratch. What's the point of that? My magic just disappeared. The whole point of the magic box was that I wasn't going to have to build a server, right? Even worse, you've got the one, but actually, when you look at most products, it looks more like this when you actually build. And then you check the backlog, and this happens. And you realize you're going to have to build a lot of server to support your magic server. And again, the whole point was I wasn't going to have to build APIs, right? So that was the first problem that I hit with that approach. The other thing that happened is if you take, this is an example from the StepZen documentation. If you take that schema-first approach, you quite often have to code some behavior into that schema because there are things you need to be able to tell the server, hey, you should behave like this. And this is an example of transforming data. And that transform looks a lot like code to me. But the problem that I have is I can't actually get in and write the code. So if they don't support the magical keywords that I need to take that REST API that returns data in a very weird way and transform it just right, I'm now stuck. And now guess what I have to do? I get to write a whole GraphQL server from scratch all over again. So we kept hitting this problem where we're working along, everything's great, then we hit one requirement, and boom, now you have to write everything again. And that was really frustrating. I just want to be able to tap into the permission system from that magic box. I want to be able to get full create, retrieve, update, delete. And then I want to be able to extend that. And so this is largely why we've built what we've built. So I need magic, but I need to be able to edit it. and I need to be able to add custom operations, and I want the result of this to be just JavaScript, just a Node.js server, so that I can deploy and run it wherever I want. So the technology that enabled all this to happen for us was actually pretty cool. Something you might have had experience with was code. It was a bit anticlimactic, I guess. So why code? Why did we pick code? Well, the tooling is actually pretty good. We have a lot of tools for working with code. Code's really widely used. We've all had experience with it. You can express anything you want in code, and it is ultimately flexible. So there are lots of positives to using code. But there are some downsides, which is if you're writing everything in code, it tends to be pretty inefficient. So we needed to bridge that gap. So what we decided to do was there's going to be a bunch of things that we can't predict. Things like your schema, your operations, what backends you're going to connect to. We can't tell you what those are going to be beforehand. But we can tell you that you're going to need to be able to do create, retrieve, update, delete. You're going to need to be able to join your data. You're going to need to be able to filter your data. And we can just see that coming a mile away. So what if we had a bunch of code that we wrote that deals with all of that basic stuff that constantly needs to happen, and then you could contribute a little bit of code for your stuff, and just the things you need to extend. We could take those two things, we could build them, and just get JavaScript out. And in fact, we could even take the approach of there's no distinction in the box between your code and our code. It's just code. So here's an example. This is a Star Wars API. So this is Luke Skywalker's record. But it's just a REST API. You can see that there's some fields there, and there's a link to another entity. This is truncated just for an example, but the vehicles entity here is linked with these other URLs. And if we wanted to model that in our world, we could do something like this. And all this says is there's an entity. It's called person. Here's how you get the data for it. That's the provider bit at the top. And here are the fields. And here's what they are. And the most complicated field is the one that says there are vehicles, and they relate to the vehicles entity. When I say code, this is what I mean. This looks a lot like a GraphQL schema, the type of information that you specify in a GraphQL schema. But what's different about it is you can actually code behavior in here too, because we're now working in code instead of schema language. Now, the provider that I mentioned, this says how to go get the data. This is a full example. Go get it from this URL at this path. And then we've got a field config to do some mapping on the actual data that comes back. So I can just write a function called URL to ID transform, and I can just say, run this on my field when it comes back. So what you end up with is this approach where everything starts off simple, and then you can extend it as you need. So this approach we found is even better, because you take this entity in code, this schema in code stuff, where you can code your behavior in, you build, you get a schema out, a JavaScript server, and actually we create a whole admin UI for you as well, which is just like a database editor. You can extend that, override all the components in that as well. So I'll go ahead and tempt the demo gods. We will see how we go with this. But I will create a GraphWeaver project. So what the init command is going to do is it's just going to generate a skeleton project. I'm going to call this one, and we're going to use SQLite just for simplicity. So now it's gone ahead and created those files. So I'll go into that directory. And now I will go ahead and import my database. Now, because the database has a lot of schema information already, we don't need to do a lot to bring it in. So this is a little bit malformatted, but you can see it's seen some tables in this database. And just before I proceed, I'll show you what database that actually is. This is the Chinook database, which is an open source example database, which tests a lot of features of database engines. They have this for all these different database backends. Here are all the tables and relationships. But you can see it's a pretty standard database schema. So I'll go ahead and let it write those. And now we just need to install our dependencies. Hopefully, the NPM registry is nice to us today.
While this is doing this, just to clarify,
Yeah.
So basically what you did was you imported an existing database schema, and it generated all these TypeScript files.
Yeah, so I'll actually show you the files that it's created, but I'm just going to go ahead and start it so you can see what we actually got out of that process. This should now be live. Yep. So we have some entities here. If I click on these entities, this is the admin area I was telling you guys about, but you can see it's already, you go to albums, it's already joining across to the tracks entity and showing the tracks that are related to an entity. You can edit this. If you look at the network request, this is a standard GraphQL API. The admin area doesn't get any privileged access to your backend at all. So that's all you have to do to take a database and turn it into a GraphQL API. So this is getting that magic portion of the kind of schema-first approach. But what we've actually created out of here is files. And these files, so we have some ORM entities, just so you have a way to work with your database from your own custom logic as well as ours. And then these are the schema entities that I mentioned before. So again, add entity, general, same approach as that example that I showed. So that's all it takes to get an API up and running. Yep?
This is generated?
Yeah, so these files were generated from the database schema, but you can also write them by hand if you need to, but you quite often don't need to, because if you're starting from a database, which is, you're going to have at least one database in just about anything you build, is my experience. So you can just work in that database schema, and then you can generate the files from it. But we have now one, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Is this only for SQL databases, or can you also run on NoSQLs like MongoDB?
You can also do NoSQL. So I'm going to show you, I'll join this to a REST API now, so you can see how that works. So just before I get too far along here, so I will go ahead and check out our next step. So what this has done is we've now created another set of schema files. So these don't have any entry in the SQLite entities side because they're not living in the SQLite database. These are REST APIs. So basically, if there's a provider for it, you can join to it with GraphWeaver, and you can also write your own providers quite easily as well. If you need to connect to something like, I don't know, a truck scale, like I mentioned earlier, we consistently need to build these. So this just tells it where to get the data. This is exactly the example I showed before. And now, when I start this up, it should refresh for us. We will now have REST entities in here, as well as the database entities. In this case, I've gone ahead and told it that you can each invoice has a delivery driver. The delivery drivers are just people from the Star Wars universe, to show you how this works. But you can see they're joined over here. And in terms of the actual GraphQL that you can run, you can filter the data from one data source to the other. So you can even say invoices, and you can say that they have delivery drivers, and give me their name. And this can give me the total amount. So this is standard kind of schema stitching that you've seen. But what's really cool is we allow you to actually do a filter here where you can reference those things as well. So now that's filtered based on the REST data. So the REST data, we go get the IDs for Luke Skywalker, then we take that to the database and we get the actual data. So what we find is with this level of filtering coming out of the box, there's very little that you actually need to write custom. But when you do, you can, and that's the important distinction between that schema first and the code first approach that we like to take. So I will go ahead and kill this. In addition, we can add auth. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And I'm just going to start this up again. So in order to add auth, in this case, I decided to use just password authentication, but we supported a bunch of different authentication methods and auth providers. You can integrate with Auth0, Okta, any of these types of things. But in our case, what we've done here is we need to give it a way to figure out the user group for a particular user. So this is just a function that gets a user ID and tells you what group it's in. I've gone ahead and done this set implicit allow just for a demo. So if you're prototyping, this is really useful, but you would never want to use this in production. This will allow everybody to look at everything by default unless there's a access control list. And then I've told it where to save the passwords and the hashes. So what's really interesting with GraphWeaver is we don't privilege any one particular data source. So it's quite common that your auth provider will actually be external, or your even storage for your hashes will be external. We don't actually care where it comes from as long as we can access the data. So this type of provider is the same provider that we had for the entities. We also need to tell GraphWeaver specifically we are using password. But this is where you would configure, you can do step-up auth, you can do all kinds of crazy setups there. But we already have a login box, so I'm just going to grab this from the README. And are we not? No, I have to clear. Must have been working on another project. Yeah, cool. So now we have our REST and we have our database, and we're logged in, and we can now sign out, and we can put access control lists on this data. So our delivery driver entity now has an access control list, which says the light side group can access any data in this entity that matches this filter, and the dark side group can just read all of the data here. So we find this workflow to be really productive, especially when you start putting custom operations in here. So now I'm going to go ahead and extend the delivery driver entity and add a custom field. So I'll just kill this. And this is the last step. Start it back up. Now the only thing we've needed to add here to get a custom field is I've defined a field that's a function. And these can be async, they can return promises, you can do whatever you want. In this case, it's just giving you a random number. But you can see the power of this because now the ACLs are applied to all of our own code as well as the code that came from the libraries. And you notice as well, I don't have any resolvers that I've had to build here. There's not a single one. It's all just using the inbuilt resolvers that come from GraphWeaver. So, yeah. So now if I go to my delivery drivers, now we have random numbers on each one. So yeah, that's kind of a really quick demo of the things you can do with GraphWeaver. And in terms of where to go from here, we have permissions. We can override entire operations. You can also just override the data that goes into an operation. So if you don't want to write a whole resolver yourself, but you just want to say, every time an invoice is created, also create a receipt or something like this, you can use GraphQL hooks, which are built into GraphWeaver to say, when this operation happens, just edit the data before you pass it on to the built-in logic. You can join in more data sources. You always get CRUD for free, and you get this cross-data source filtering, regardless of whether your backend supports it. It does it in memory, so that does have scaling limitations. There's only so much data you can jam into RAM, but it works for the vast majority of cases in our experience. And if you want to take this and use it as your subgraph, which is a pretty common workflow for organizations, you can make this federation ready with one line of code. So you drop a single line into the GraphWeaver constructor, and it is now compliant with Federation 2.0 spec. So yeah, if you guys want to have a play with GraphWeaver on your own machines, you don't have to install anything at all. You can actually run the backend and the admin area all in your browser without any installation. We're using web containers to do that. You'll see all the Node.js logs in your browser console. It's kind of weird, but it does work. Go to demo.graphweaver.com. We do have a sponsor booth out in the hallway, so come say hi, have a chat, grill me, ask me questions, tell me I'm doing it wrong, whatever, I'm here. And we have obviously pretty comprehensive docs, and we'd love everybody to adopt GraphWeaver. We think it's a really great way to productively build APIs from that kind of prototyping phase all the way through to production and then scaling it out. And we've been using it in production for a good long while now, so thought I'd come share. Yeah.
Do you guys have any plans to extend it beyond TypeScript to other languages?
So the question was, do we have any plans to extend beyond TypeScript? At the moment, no, we don't. So we are focusing on making sure that this workflow is really effective, but it's something that we wouldn't rule out long term, but there's nothing on the roadmap right now. There's still a lot we can build, I think, before we start diversifying. Out of curiosity, which languages would you be interested in?
I mean, Python, but we do have
Yeah.
JavaScript.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned about the CRUD operations, but each of those operations, typically except for the read ones, will trigger an event in the backend system. So
Yes.
do you do anything in the GPL subscription space?
We don't currently, but it is something that's on our roadmap. So that would be something that we would be more than happy to support. Yeah, but we haven't built support for subscriptions yet. Quite often we find that because we're talking to so many different systems, edits to those systems are happening from external to GraphWeaver. So it'll be something like a CRM tool or some other SaaS platform, and it's doing its own editing of the data. And so what you really want is for those subscriptions to actually subscribe to changes in the underlying data. But a lot of those systems don't give us any notification when the data changes, so we'd have to implement some sort of polling engine or something like this inside GraphWeaver. So that's the main reason we haven't implemented it yet, but we'd be more than happy to. It is a feature that we sometimes need within our own implementations, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So most users start off with CRUD, and then they realize, hey, mostly I need CRUD, but oftentimes they need slightly more.
Yes.
And then it goes into, I need a lot more, right?
Yeah.
So one example of this is, let's say I want to create some invoices, but I want to put a limit on, you cannot have more than 5 invoices. Right?
Yep.
How easy do you think it's to add this?
Very easy. So so in your particular case, so the question, just to repeat for the camera, was quite often when you're doing CRUD, you need to put limitations or tweak the way that the CRUD works. So the example given was, if I'm pulling invoices, I need to only see 5 of them. With GraphQL hooks, you could edit the data on the way out of the server. So you could basically say, I've gotten all the invoices, trim it down to 5, or you could also edit it on the way in by specifying a filter. So you could say, whatever filter was given to me, I'm also going to put a limit of 5 on the size of the results.
I was talking more on create.
Oh, on create, yeah, you can do the same thing. So mutations work the same way as queries for us. You've got it, by default, it will generate full CRUD mutations and queries. You can then go in and override any of those resolvers if you need to. But most of the time, the hooks will actually just give you the tweak you need without actually even having to write the CRUD logic. But if you need to, there's sometimes you need like, hey, when I go through this wizard, I need to do 15 things when they hit the finish button. You can just write a function that does that and then expose it as a custom operation off to the side of all the standard CRUD as well. So yeah, the whole point was to not get in the way of you extending this. It is just Apollo server under the hood, and then it's a whole lot of tools around that to make it easier to use. So you have all the power of code. There's nothing ever going to stop you from going in and writing whatever operation you need. Yeah?
Can you repeat what databases that you support?
Yeah, so yeah, we have quite a few connectors. We've mostly focused on Postgres as the kind of central hub. So we support a lot of the SQL databases. We have integrated with MongoDB before and DynamoDB before, but those connectors aren't as fully fledged as the SQL connectors right now. So yeah, out of curiosity, which databases are you working in?
I mean, we generally, we have a variant of Mongo.
Yep.
But, it has a bunch of tweaks on top of it.
Yeah.
I just wonder if we would need to take your connector and customize it.
Quite possibly, and you're totally welcome to do that. So let me just bring this up. So this is our monorepo for GraphWeaver, which obviously we're more than happy for anybody to come contribute to if you want to build whatever you want to build. But as an example, I'll just show you the REST provider so you can see what this can look like. So that's probably quite small. Let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. Yes. Yeah, so here's the function in the provider where you get past a filter, you get past pagination, and you go off and go get the data. So for REST, this is what we're doing. Because we have to do a lot of that in-memory filtering for REST, this is a little bit longer than, say, for Mongo. You would just pass the filter down to Mongo. We actually have MicroRM is the ORM that we're using, and MicroRM has full Mongo compatibility, so it should be ready to go without tweaking, I suspect. But if you need to tweak it, you absolutely can. You can just extend our micro provider, or you can bring your own if you have to. Yeah. Any other questions? Makes sense, hopefully?
This is also generated, right, from the REST?
So this is the actual library code that's running to go get the data from REST. So this is code that we wrote, yeah, it's what is when we say like new REST provider. This is the class that you're getting. Yeah. This is just inside the GraphWeaver source code. For most GraphWeaver users, this is just in node modules. You don't care how that got there. It's just magical. Yeah. Any other questions? No worries. I'll let you guys have some time back. But yeah, come have a chat with me at the sponsor booth. I'll be more than happy to run you through it or answer anything else you have. Cool. Thank you.